Let's come back down to the Italian Peninsula and let's look at the Republic of Florence, right? You'll recall we were in Siena for a while. Now we're coming back up to Florence. Florence is a very important city-state. This is what brought about the early Renaissance in Florence. Because 15th century Florence was, again, a powerful, wealthy city-state that had become wealthy apart from the Catholic Church, that was controlled by bankers and merchants. It's this newly independently wealthy city-state. It's still a Christian society. That hasn't gone away, but there's a new interest in humanism. We talked about humanism a bit last week. I'll define it a little better here in a moment. In 1349, the artists at this time, and this started here in Florence, left the Guild of Doctors and Apothecaries and formed the Confraternity of St. Luke, the Confraternity of Painters. Right? This is happening in the late Middle Ages. And Florence was the first to consider painting, sculpture, and architecture as liberal arts, and eventually it would be something you would go to university to learn. So any of you who may be art majors, or at least majors dealing in the arts of some sort, whether you be an acting major, whether you be a major in one of our music programs, right? The fact that you study that at university, you can draw a direct line back to the fact that Florence was the first city-state in Europe to consider art, painting, and sculpture to be, painting, sculpture, and architecture to be liberal arts, ones that you would go to university to learn. They have tons then of civic pride. This, of course, is the rinse and repeat story of the Renaissance. They're a democratic republic, which they saw as being linked back both to Greece, a democracy, and Rome, a republic, right? They took the ideas of both and sort of combined them together. In many ways, that's what the United States has. They had a chancellor as we got into the 15th century who encouraged humanist philosophy in the city, again breaking away from the church's position that human beings are lowly, right, and need to atone for the original sin of Adam and Eve, and the sin of the death of Christ on the cross. This starts saying, well, you know what? Maybe those Greeks and Romans had it right. Maybe we humans are actually pretty awesome, and we should look at ourselves and start to see if we can't explore our own potentials. How limitless is our potential? And they start to develop these extremely high standards for the city. They want to have only the best of the best, right? They want to say only the best can be found in Florence. And that extends to art as well. And so competitions would be held for big public art projects. Humanism, by the way, to give ourselves a good, solid definition, is specifically when we're talking about in the Renaissance, humanism refers to an emphasis on education and an expanding of knowledge, especially of classical antiquity, the exploration of individual potential and desire to excel. So we start thinking about individuals, not just sort of the human race as a whole, and a commitment to civic responsibility and moral duty. And humanists, that should have an S, humanists looked back to ancient Greece and Rome for their models. One of those models that I want to talk about here, because it'll come up later, is Neoplatonism. And this was a philosophical and theological system which worked to reconcile the ideas of the ancient Greek philosophers Socrates and Plato and the prophecies told by ancient Greek sibyls with Christianity. Essentially, they found ways to make all that stuff that Socrates and Plato were talking about, where they were really writing about Christianity. They just didn't know it, right? That the source, the good that we talked about when we were talking about Plato, was God. And they just didn't know that that's what they were writing about. And then the ancient Greek sibyls, these were fortune tellers who were believed to have a direct link to the gods. And we had tons of their writing had survived and had been passed down, again, in sort of bootleg form, if you will, because a lot of that stuff had been repressed. And now this new generation of what are called Neoplatonists are reading that stuff. They like that stuff. They feel a little guilty about liking it because they're supposed to be good Christians. And so they start taking the predictions that were written by those ancient Greek sibyls and saying they were actually talking about God and Jesus. They just didn't know it yet either. Keep that in mind. We'll come back to Neoplatonism later. Humanism is the big overarching ideology that's going to come into play. In Florence, we have the House of Medici. And understand when we say house in this case, it's a way of saying family, right? The Medici family. They're important. The Medici family dominated Florence from 1434 to 1494. And their family wealth came from mercantile and banking interests and was strengthened by certain political alliances and religious alliances for that matter as well. Specifically, their biggest source of revenue was the Medici Bank. And it was it's the first bank that one would say resembles what we think of as a bank to this day. It dominated Italian banking, not just in Florence, but the entire peninsula in the 15th and 16th centuries. And there was even the Pope kept his money in the Medici Bank. And since they had this money, and since they were so important in the city, they encouraged the innovations that were happening in Florence because, again, they reflected well on themselves. And so they used art as a means of flaunting their wealth. And under their supervision, the supervision of the Medici, the Renaissance firmly takes hold and begins in Florence, right? Yes, we've looked other places around Europe, at some of which even overlaps this time period. But the first very much intentionally driven steps toward what would become the Renaissance, right? The very intentional, like, nope, we are making a new society. That happens in Florence and then spreads throughout. So let's take a look at this guy, Filippo Brunelleschi, born in 1377 and died in 1446. Philip Brunelleschi, particularly important because he's a Florentine. He's traveled all around the Mediterranean to study the architecture of antiquity all around the Mediterranean, and then also went up north to study Gothic cathedrals and things of that nature. And he becomes an architect by combining all of those ideas. He's also credited with developing linear perspective. We'll look at that in a moment. But any of you, again, who are either art majors or art minors, or you just happen to take drawing 1 with me, and you had all that time where you were having to learn linear perspective, here's your guy that you can hate, right? He's the one to blame for that stuff. What he is particularly famous for is that he entered and won a competition in Florence to design and build a dome on top of the Cathedral of Florence. Remember, over in the Byzantine Empire, there have been domes on top of some of the churches and things of that nature. But in Western Europe, after the fall of the Roman Empire, how that was done had been forgotten. And so 1,000 years have gone by and no one's figured out how to put a dome on top of a building. So I forgot I had all that. Ugh. All right. So he submits designs and he's figured out how to make it happen. He wins, and this is what he comes up with. Now the cathedral itself he didn't build. That had been there. It's a medieval building. What he was responsible for was this dome on top of a drum here, and just in order to show off, it seems he even surrounded it with some extra little domes. Florence needed someone who could figure out how to do this because they wanted to be able to claim the first dome in Western Europe since antiquity. So what did he do? He created a drum. He's looking back at ancient Rome. He however doesn't have the advantage of concrete the way that the Romans did, and so he builds a drum, but that drum is not round. It's polygonal, right? It's a polygon, and then he creates the dome by setting up essentially some Gothic arches that kind of come to a point, but not quite, right? They're a little more flattened than the Gothic pointed arch, rather. But he keeps their ribs, right, for support. Because again, how that was done by the Romans, they hadn't figured out. This was a way of sort of cheating it, if you will, right? Build these ribs for support. He made it where the bottom portion of the dome that sits atop the drum was wider, and then it narrows and becomes thinner as it moves up so that there's more weight at the bottom than at the top. He figured that out and he won, and then bam, there you have it. The first dome in Western Europe since antiquity. And again, like I said, you're going to hear that a lot. You're going to hear the first fill in the blank since antiquity when we're in the Renaissance. All right, so Brunelleschi, he needs a means of making his architectural drawings. And he wants them to look realistic and feel like they have 3 dimensions in them. And so he develops this thing that is referred to as linear perspective. We still use it today. And it works on a certain mathematical system of imaginary lines, really, that are put on the page. So you have first this line right here, this horizontal line, that is appropriately enough termed the horizon line. That horizon line represents the literal horizon, but it is also the viewer's eye level. Hence why you can see it going through the head of this person who's meant to be the observer. Right? Then, right there, that dot that you can sort of see on the horizon, that's referred to as the vanishing point. This is the point where parallel lines that are moving away from the viewer, which will be called orthogonals, converge. It's the point that things that are moving away from you would eventually meet out there on the horizon. Let me move myself out of the way here. Then we have those orthogonals. And up, I moved myself in the way. I thought it was up here. Orthogonal lines. Those are the parallel lines that move away from the viewer. They are given the illusion of moving away from the viewer because they're all converging at a point. Right? That gives the illusion of 3-dimensional space. And artists would become obsessed with linear perspective once this had been developed. Right here we have the delivery of the keys. This is interesting for many reasons, right? One of which is the fact that it uses that linear perspective, right? That's a Florentine development, and Perugino is a Florentine. But also it's indicative of how much the Florentines thought of themselves and how proud they were of their city-state, because this, as you see, is a painting of the delivery of the keys of heaven, that is, specifically to St. Peter, who's going to be the one who's going to guard heaven's gates and let excuse me, those arriving know who can get in and who can't. That's a momentous occasion, and it should be happening in heaven. Where is it happening? Well, look at that architecture. We've got Roman architecture, and right there, smack dab in the middle, we have some clearly Florentine architecture, because it's clear that Brunelleschi designed whatever that is in the middle. It doesn't seem to be the cathedral, but it's definitely something he designed. Right? So we have this momentous occasion happening in Florence because we're just that proud of our city. Right? And we don't see showing pride in our city as being blasphemous anymore. Then it's also interesting just because, I don't know, it amuses me that all these people back here, hang on, all these people back here look like they're ice skating. I'm sure they're playing some sort of game. I don't know. But the obsession with linear perspective even gets a little goofy at times because understand, once linear perspective is designed, it becomes a means of taking a flat surface, right? Whatever the painting is going to be painted upon, that flat surface, and making it look like it is a deep, deep extension of the space that the viewer, you and me, are standing in and looking at. And so it's kind of like the 3D movies of its day, right? And if you remember, like it's starting to go away now, but the big 3D movie craze, that boom that was happening for like the last 15 years or so, it got a little ridiculous, right? Like in the first, when it first began, we were all like, ooh, ah, wow. And then people started throwing 3D effects into anything, even if it didn't need it. And the stuff started to look bad and the 3D wasn't even all that great, right? Because ridiculous stuff started happening. Well, here, this is kind of what's happening here with this painting by Paolo Uccello, who has this big battle, the Battle of San Romano, going on, and clashing of knights and lances breaking and what have you, the chaos of all that. And isn't it nice that the soldiers decided to die and fall to the ground in perfect one-point perspective? And that the lances, when they broke and fell, they all fell down in this nice little perfect linear perspective, right? It got a little silly. Masaccio was one of the earliest Florentine painters to make significant advancements in the medium. He was also highly influenced by the architecture of Brunelleschi. He's also looking back at Giotto a couple of generations before him, and he painted frescoes for prominent Florentine families and businessmen. So most of his surviving work can be found in private chapels as opposed to the more public cathedrals and things of that nature. But he made some innovations in that he specifically wanted to make his paintings feel like a space that we could step into and that there would be distance inside that painting. But also, there was some interactivity in the storytelling. He wanted the storytelling to involve the viewer. That's a self-portrait that he included in a painting, and notice how he's kind of looking outward at us. That's some of the interactivity that I'm talking about. Probably his most famous piece is the Holy Trinity with the Virgin, St. John, and two donors, right? These two people down here would have been the donors who paid for this painting, so they get to be there for the crucifixion. Right? And we have a representation of the Holy Trinity, God the Father, God the Holy Spirit, God the Son. Let's move in a little closer. By, again, interestingly, and as a departure from the Middle Ages, God represented as an old man here, God the Father, God the Son being represented in the classic, I guess I should say, representation of how Jesus looks, and descending between the two of them is a dove, the Holy Spirit. I can come back to the full piece here. And you see his attention to realism. Drapery falls in response to the body that's underneath it. The columns and the pilasters on the outside are Roman in design and are based also on the architecture of Brunelleschi. And down here at the bottom, we have what appears to be a cross-section of a tomb in a crypt where there is a skeleton completely skin and fleshless, and an inscription written above it that says, "What you are, I once was. What I am, you will be." Suggestive, where there's a little bit of that medieval Catholic way of thinking, right? You are gonna die. That kind of a remembrance. Like, don't forget. Don't become so full of yourself that you forget that you're going to die. But he's also including all this humanistic stuff. Brunelleschi was a big humanist, and he's including stuff that looks like Brunelleschi's architecture. He's including that linear perspective. Let me go to that real quick, right? Where all the lines in it seem to be moving downward to a horizon line and a vanishing point that's here. Right? If we follow all these lines, right, which pulls the whole composition down through Christ to the foot of the cross, where if you're standing in front of this painting, even if you happen to be taller than where that horizon line is, which you're probably not, this is a pretty tall painting, but even if you were taller than that, you're made to feel like you are low and down here very close to the foot of the cross. Mary here, who presents Christ to us, she is looking out at us and looking very disappointed in us, by the way, is also a bit of medieval Catholic leftover here, because again, she's presenting Christ on the cross to us and giving us this disappointed look, because again, we are the ones who are responsible for putting Christ there. And don't you forget it, always be atoning for that sin. So we live in this moment where there's the melding of still old medieval Christian ideas and a new burgeoning humanistic way of looking at things. But it's not as if the old Christian, medieval Christian ideology just went away, was just gone, boom, dead. Now, I like this little video. This little video, I think, lays it all out nicely for us. So I'm just going to play it. Let you listen.
A dominant characteristic of Renaissance art was the conviction that it should imitate nature. We see this idea in the Florentine painter and architect Giotto di Bondone. Giotto's circumstances were symptomatic of two great tendencies in the period. There was a new kind of civic society, driven by the early capitalism of merchants, bankers, politicians, and tyrants. This early capitalism found dynamic expression in the Italian city-states. This was coupled with the rise of humanism, the literary and philosophical movement that looked towards antiquity. At the same time, the rules of geometrical perspective were devised and codified by the architect Filippo Brunelleschi and the humanist Leon Battista Alberti. Modern art now had a theory of its own. In the Netherlands, the integration of rising civic ideals and existing religious imperatives was no less apparent than in Italy. The Netherlandish technique of oil painting caused a sensation in terms of light, colour, shade and descriptive detail. The most profound early response was in Venice, where Giovanni Bellini and Titian revolutionised the use of colour. The optical effects of oil paint were taken to new levels by Leonardo da Vinci. Painting was extended from the geometry of light to the ways that the eye and brain function in acts of seeing. Anatomy was extended into the processes of thinking and reacting. The job of the artist became to remake nature.
To remake nature. That becomes the goal of art. Right, because art for a long time wasn't concerned with remaking nature. The Renaissance is wanting to remake nature. They're wanting to reclaim something that they feel has been lost. right on the cusp of the early Renaissance, is the first of our Ninja Turtles here, Donatello. He was an Italian Renaissance sculptor from Florence. We're still in Florence. We haven't left yet. Who went around and studied ancient Greek and Roman sculpture. Remember, that stuff is still standing in his time. Again, as a lot of it is still to this day. And he could go and study and try to see if he could figure out how they might have done what they did. What it was that they were interested in. Because, the Middle Ages had gotten away from a lot of that stuff. And he's credited with creating the first completely Renaissance sculpture style. Right? And that specifically means a sculptural style that is purely Renaissance because of its humanistic ideology and its tendency to look back at Greek and Roman, ancient Greek and Roman models. There you go. Ancient styles, humanist ideology, and some Neoplatonist ideologies sneak into his work as well. It was completely free of any medieval or Gothic influences. We don't look at his work and think that we're seeing anything that is even international Gothic in its manner. So right here we have the equestrian monument of Gattamelata, sculpted from somewhere between 1445 and 1453. It's a little difficult to date some of his work. A lot of it just gets dated by, given the level of his skill, it seems like it belongs to this particular period of time in his work. So the success of Donatello led to this commission in the Republic of Venice. This is a Venetian work. He's a Florentine, but again, at this point, Florence has not only done such a good job of convincing themselves that they are the best of the best, they've convinced others around Europe that they are the best, and so it becomes a thing that if you want good art, go to Florence and get yourself a Florentine artist. They wanted to honor in Venice a recently dead commander of the Venetian armies with a statue. And what they wanted was an equestrian statue. Now, you'll recall that was a Roman thing. We haven't seen equestrian statues since ancient Rome. So here's Donatello, who reinvigorates that genre and gives us the first equestrian statue since antiquity. So, another feather in the cap of the Renaissance here. Again, I meant to show you this comparison, right? There's that sculpture from over 1,000 years before Donatello is working on his, of Marcus Aurelius on a horse. Now, interestingly, in Marcus Aurelius's case, he himself, the sculptor has made Marcus Aurelius oversized. Right? He looks too big to be on this horse. Whereas Donatello has made the horse look really large. And that, it seems to him, to be indicative of the kind of control that Gattamelata has over this large and strong creature. And that suggests something about the character of the man himself. This is a piece he did of St. Mark that he did somewhere between 1411 and 1413. So I'm going back in time in his career a bit here. He's really a young buck in this one. This is a statue of St. Mark that was carved for the Guild of Linen Makers. The linen makers and tailors, they looked at St. Mark as their patron saint. And it showcases his attention to fabrics, which makes sense if he's making this for the Guild of Fabric Makers and Tailors. You see the attention that's being paid to the folds of fabric on the robe that St. Mark is wearing. Even this like pillow that he's standing on, which would have been a symbol of the Guild of Fabric Makers, like responds to the pressure of his feet on it, right? he's carving into stone here, but is taking the stone and making it look like these different materials. However, something about the stance. Do you notice something about the way that St. Mark is standing? That's something that you should know about, but again, at the time of Donatello, had not been seen for over 1,000 years. He's standing in that classic S curve. This is contrapposto, taken from the Greeks, taken from the Romans, something that hasn't been included in statuary for a long time, partially, again, because of the relaxed nature of it. That just didn't sit right with Gothic sculptors and with much of the Middle Ages. But also, once you do that, once you have a sculpture where someone is in that kind of a position, you've got to figure out how to distribute the weight in such a way that the thing doesn't fall over. So a lot of medieval sculptors didn't bother with that. Certainly, Donatello is reintroducing, let's say, the classical pose of contrapposto into Renaissance sculpture, and that this is the statue that gets that distinction put upon it by art historians. Yeah, I keep forgetting I have these comparisons, right? There's, Polycleides, almost 2,000 years earlier, who's working with this contrapposto stance in this piece that we looked at earlier, the spear bearer. And let's dive into Sandro Botticelli. Sandro Botticelli, born in 1445 and lived to 1510. He was a Florentine painter and one of the favorite painters of the Medici and their circle of rich, hoity-toity influencers of their time. Specifically because he was giving them everything they wanted in art. He exemplified 15th century Italian Renaissance interests, the interests of the Medici. His paintings were a combination of scholarly humanism, art, duh, but that's what they want. They want art, literature, Greco-Roman mythology, and Neoplatonism. Again, taking ancient Greek ideas, philosophies, and mysticism, and somehow finding a way to make those things Christian. We see that in this particularly famous painting of his. You've no doubt seen it, The Birth of Venus, painted in 1482. You've no doubt seen it even if you didn't know what it was. All right. It is a story from ancient mythology, not the Bible. And that is interesting because we haven't seen anything quite like that. Right? Most of the art that we have been looking at for these past, the past millennia, have been either Christian stories from the Bible, or they were like current slice of life stories, or they were historical stories, right? We don't really see something from ancient Greece or Rome like this. We have the god and goddess Zephyr and Chloris up here, who are blowing Venus in from her birthplace out in the ocean. Venus's figure, note first and foremost that contrapposto position she's in, and her figure is based on the Aphrodite of Knidos from Hellenistic Greek period. But this whole painting would seem to be not Christian in any form or fashion. However, the Neoplatonists had developed ways, again, of rectifying and justifying to one another the Greek and Roman stories and Christianity. And so they had this weird way of taking the idea of the Greek goddess Venus, the Roman goddess Venus, Aphrodite, she would have been in Greece, and saying she existed in two forms. There was her celestial form, the source of divine love, and there was her worldly form, earthly love, both of which were ordained by God. She stands in for both godly love and earthly love. Yeah, we can totally make that work, right? We can totally make that work with Christianity. So Botticelli's painting could allude to those interests, right? But we can't get away, and I at least have to touch on it briefly, that there's a certain amount of, well, all right, this would have been a painting that was a privately owned painting. Would have been in a Medici mansion somewhere. We can imagine, right? A group of Medici men and their high class, rich, wealthy, educated friends standing before this Botticelli and going on and praising it for all that it has, and perhaps even pontificating on those ideas of both godly and earthly love and the connections of the goddess Venus with as being a sort of embodiment, a symbol for that godly versus earthly love, and right, and all those different things, and all this like intellectual talk being thrown at the painting, and it doesn't change the fact that it's still a naked woman standing there in front of us, kind of hiding the private parts, if you will, but only just barely, right? So to a certain extent, sure, all that intellectual stuff is there. And no doubt they would have talked about it in that way, but still in so many ways, it is Renaissance porn. Right? Because it gave some good Christian intellectual men of the humanist persuasion an excuse to ogle a woman's nude body and do so under the auspicions of we're intellectuals, right? And this is a painting of the old ancient Greek and Roman story, and there are all these connections to how we worship now. This makes it okay, right? We can all stand here and enjoy this beautiful woman, right? That's there whether or not it was intended. It can't help but be there.